my friends, my shapy friends, my circular, rectangular, star-shaped, and windmill-shaped friends. I am Bins, and I welcome you to the last video in the Shapez BEASTMAM series. Let's do this. I know, I'm sad about it too, but that shouldn't mean that today's video should be a sad one. No, you and I are still gonna have some fun together, right? On today's menu, the very last aspect I would like to review for the BEASTMAM, and that is the 3 modes of operation you see at the top right here: buffer mode, purge mode, and auto mode. Therefore, the last video will be called Chapter 6E Shenanigans Modes of Operation. And we're going to start off with auto mode. What auto mode does is basically toggle the shape input. It's going to determine which kind of shape we are going to let the machine produce. If auto mode is disabled, then the shape that the machine will produce is the current hub shape. On the other hand, if auto mode is enabled, then the machine will flip into a state of feeding the machine a set of 40 handcrafted shapes, most of which, obviously, you know me, contain floating layers and or smelted regions, so in other words, a particularly hard set of shapes for the machine to produce. Now, let's have a look at the wiring for that. And it all starts with this orange wire right here, which is in charge of running the 2 modes. Now, as you can see, a NOT gate ensures that if the auto mode button is disabled, we take the hub shape for an input. And if the button is enabled, instead the machine will take the input on this green wire. Now, the input on the green wire, that is a more interesting story. As you can see, to the left, there is this very long chain of comparing units. Nothing too elaborated though, in the same style we've seen in other parts of the machine. There is an input trigger and an output line, and each shape is connected to a comparing unit, and if there is a match with the input trigger, it cues the shape onto the orange output line. Now, at the bottom, there is a memory cell that retains the last value, and that is how we get the input for auto mode. But now, let's have a look at how the signal changes. There is this timer right here, this blue thing, that kicks into gear when there is a value on this purple wire. And this purple wire, well, that is connected to the final storage's rightmost output pin. This means that the timer is only triggered once the shape is ready and outputting to the hub. Now, the end of the timer in the top left right here, that is connected to the retained signal's green wire. So when the timer ends, then for 1 tick only, the signal is passed into the selector system, where the signal will match with one of the comparing units, which will output the next shape in line, and then the cycle starts over, okay? At a frame rate of 20 FPS, the timer's length equals roughly 10 seconds, so this means that in auto mode, the machine is instructed to produce a certain shape, which it will, and once it is ready, it will keep feeding that shape into the hub for roughly 10 seconds, after which a new shape is selected, and then the process repeats. Alright? Now, a final thing I want to make sure of is that when the shape flips, the timer will also be reset, because otherwise, when the timer reaches the end of its cycle and emits a pulse to the shape change module, the timer itself will also start a new cycle. And since it will take a few ticks for the shape to change, as well as a few ticks more for the storage to clear, which feeds the timer to begin with, the timer itself will have moved ahead in its new cycle already, thus shortening the duration of the next cycle. In other words, shortening the duration that the next shape will be feeding into the hub, all right? And I don't want that. And that is what this little setup right here is for. Now, to begin with, the timer can only run if 3 criteria are met. The first one is that auto mode needs to be enabled on this orange wire, right? That one's pretty obvious. Then, these 2 green signals need to match. The leftmost green signal that runs into this comparing unit is the input signal, and the right one is the signal of the shapes currently moving along the belts. And then thirdly, there must also be shapes in the storage, which triggers this purple wire right here. Now, only if all 3 of them are true, then this blue wire will carry a 1. And as soon as one of the criteria isn't met, then the signal is cut. And that will, in turn, trigger this falling edge detector, which will emit a brief pulse of gray paint signal onto the exclusive OR gates right here. Those setups can only have 1 or 0 values on the wire, and that means that the paint signal is guaranteed to create a conflict. In case you don't know this, if you have a conflict on a wire, if you have a conflicted wire feeding into any virtual unit, then that virtual unit will go back to its default state. And in case of the XOR gates, that default state is a 0, which in practice means that if we emit this pulse, this burst of gray paint onto these wires, which are going to be 1 or 0, the conflict will effectively reset the timer. Neat, right? So that's auto mode for you. Now, let's have a look at purge mode. Purge mode will clean the machine, which can be beneficial because sometimes when loading the save game, the machine doesn't actually work. Don't ask me why exactly, because I'm afraid I don't know the details, but I guess sometimes the game just happens to load up with an unlucky mix of storage contents and a given set of values on some of the wires or something. I don't really know, to be honest. I've just observed that this might tilt the machine in the beginning of loading up the save game. And in that case, purge mode is like a hard reset button for the BEASTMAM. It will kill all the inputs and wait until there is nothing moving over any of the belts anymore. When we enable purge mode, it will trigger a gray color signal on the orange auto mode wire, causing it to create a conflict. Now again, the conflict is guaranteed because otherwise the orange wire is guaranteed to carry either a 1 or a 0, and therefore adding like another value, in this case the paint, is guaranteed to create a conflict. And because there is a conflict on that wire now, the first thing that purge mode will actually do is disable and reset the auto mode timer we just spoke about in case it was running. The second thing is that the conflict on the orange wire, it will also disable both the inputs that can become the main input signal, whether it be the one from the hub or the one from the auto mode array. Neither of them is allowed to be passed onwards when the machine is in purge mode. And then finally, thirdly, and finally, one of 2 color values will be output to the purge mode display right here, either red or green. And there is this multiplexer that I used for that. This multiplexer, it takes for a side input, it takes the belt reader signal from the final stacker for a side input. If there is a side input, then the multiplexer's output color will be red, and if there is no side input, then it will be green. Now, because of the way the rest of the machine is built, more specifically, the part we discussed about the 5th layer shenanigans in the first video of this chapter, the fact that the input signal is now cut means that we simultaneously trigger the cleanup function of the 5th layer, so indirectly, enabling purge mode will trigger this machine's cleanup function, keeping the belts flowing until all of the storages are empty. And as long as the belts are flowing, the reader display belts will have shapes on them, which will sustain the multiplexer's red color output. And only if there are no more shapes on any of the belts, then the multiplexer's side input will be absent, thus triggering the green color on the display, indicating to the player that we're good to go. As soon as the purge mode button is disabled, the machine can take an input shape value again. Either the one from the hub if auto mode is disabled, and otherwise the one from the predetermined array. And then, finally, there is buffer mode. The purpose of buffer mode is to let the machine level up if we want to. After all, this is still an MAM. So since in free play, the hub starts requesting 4 items per second, but that number steadily increases as levels go up, the single output belt right here that the BEASTMAM has, well, at some point it's not going to cut it anymore. So this save game's upgrade tiers are set to level 78, which means that the belt speed is set to 24 items per second. So as soon as the hub level reaches that threshold, the BEASTMAM needs to rely on a store and release mechanism in order to meet the demand. So when the buffer mode button is pressed, then this purple wire is triggered and it takes a ridiculous detour to eventually end up at this filter right here. I swear that's the shortest way I found to weave it through the holy spaghetti fest that is the wiring in the general hub area. Alright? So anyway, when this filter receives a 0 signal, and you can see it through the cracks right here, when the filter receives a 0 signal, which it will when buffer mode is active, the shapes will no longer be sent into this storage setup that we've been looking at so far, but they are redirected to the right instead. Now through a hyperlink, the first thing that these shapes will encounter is another filter. This filter trashes everything that is not the target shape. And the shapes that do get to pass, well, they are directed into this row of mini storages right here, which will gradually start to fill up, starting at the leftmost one. Now, I admit this will take forever and a day, so I am more than willing to admit that buffer mode is a proof of concept more than anything else, okay? Anyway, the storages gradually fill up, and that will trigger the release mechanism. So let's wait for that to happen, all right? Alright, there we go. Now, when the last storage is full and the shapes back up on this piece of belt right here, then this last storage, this one, it will send its shapes to its secondary output, the rightmost output, and that is going to trip this belt reader right here. And that belt reader, it triggers the release mechanism. So here's what the belt reader does. This AND gate that you can see right here, it is connected, well, obviously to the belt reader on one hand, but it is also connected to the leftmost storage on the other. That is this orange wire right here. So that is the other input of the AND gate. And the leftmost storage currently has contents, so the top wire is truthy. Now, when the belt reader triggers, it will trigger the AND gate as well. And that will now set a few things in motion. Firstly, on the blue wire, the input filter is cut off. This will redirect the incoming shapes directly to the output belt, so that firstly, they no longer move into the storages, and secondly, they, in turn, also move through the belt reader, which means that once this system is triggered, it will automatically sustain itself, okay? Then there is another NOT gate connected to this green wire, and the green wire is now turned into a 1, and that will open up all of the filters that had been keeping the shapes at bay. Thus, like a breached dam, all the shapes now gush out of their storages and flow straight into the hub. The output will go over 300 items per second and is sustained for long enough that the hub registers and levels up. Now, there's a weird thing going on where initially the maximum throughput threshold for Shapez Industries was, in fact, 300 items per second, but I had a save game crash at some point, which luckily I was able to retrieve for the biggest part. But after that, the throughput was suddenly capped at 200 items per second like the vanilla Shapez game, and I don't know why. I've reached out to the mod creator, Sense101, and they weren't able to tell me what happened either. So let's just ignore that weird quirk. Either way, when the game does level up, there will still be some shapes stored in our buffer mechanism, right? And this is where the second row of filters actually comes in. This row of filters is simply connected to the main input signal, as you can see right. No, wait, hold on. No, that's correct. Yeah, it is connected to the main input signal. And now that we have leveled up, the shapes in the storage suddenly don't match the input anymore. And so whatever's left in the storages is now simply trashed automatically. Also, if we were to enable purge mode while the buffer storages have content, then, just like before, the mere fact that we cut the input signal will also cause the storages to clear. And then, finally, if for whichever reason you would be so inclined, it is possible to combine buffer mode with auto mode too. In that case, we do run into a last little hurdle, which is the following. We discussed the auto mode's timer, right? The timer will determine how long the current shape needs to be supplied to the hub before we can switch over to the next shape. But the timer can only be triggered if there is content in this particular storage, right? Well now, if we've got buffer mode enabled, then none of that is going to apply. After all, the shapes will take a different route and they will never pass through that storage, and since that storage unit is one of the pillars that the timer mechanism and consequentially the input switch mechanism depend on, we've now sabotaged auto mode. The timer will never be triggered, the shapes will never switch over, and so the current shape will be produced forever. And of course, having the OCD that I have, I obviously couldn't stand for that. Now could I? So there's one final thing to remedy that problem, and it comes in form of a falling edge detector connected to this orange wire. The orange wire will be truthy if the leftmost storage has shapes in it. So that means when the storage clears and the signal on this orange wire becomes void again, then the falling edge detector will trigger a pulse, and well, that is connected to the shape input switch module. And that, my friends, is how that works. It is with mixed feelings that I announce that we've reached the end of the BEASTMAM series. I am super happy with this machine, and I am happy that I've been able to share it with all of you. But on the other hand, this project has taken a long time between building the BEASTMAM in the first place, but then also recording over 40 videos to review it and showcase it to the world. I think it's taken about a year. And in that sense, it is the end of a chapter for me. And I realized that this particular thing I am doing is located in a very, very small niche. But I am very grateful for the people that have been on the journey with me. Thank you for watching these videos, and thank you for your support, your kind words, and your curiosity, both in the YouTube comments and in the Shapez Discord server. Still, one final obligatory call to action to subscribe to the channel. Bins, why should I subscribe to the channel if this is the last video in the series? Well, because the next Shapez project is already in the making. So, I hope you will join me there as well. My Shapey friends, this is it for now.